The phone call broke the silence at 11:42 p.m. It was a sharp, jagged ring on a device usually reserved for high-level syndicate payoffs and cold-blooded directives. Dante Vane, a man whose ink-covered skin told a story of 1,000 sins, stared at the screen. He expected a threat. Instead, he heard a sob. "He's beating my mama," a tiny voice whispered through the speaker. "Please help." Dante's jaw tightened. He had lived his life surrounded by violence. But this was different. A 7-year-old girl named Lila reaching out into the dark because she had nowhere else to turn. Before his brain could even process the risk to his reputation, he spoke 3 words: "I'm coming." His lieutenants watched in stunned silence as the most feared enforcer in the city grabbed his keys and walked out without a word. They didn't know that the trembling in that girl's voice had just resurrected a ghost Dante had spent 25 years trying to bury. As Dante's black sedan tore through the industrial district, the engine's roar felt like a physical extension of his own hammering pulse. He wasn't driving as the Syndicate Ghost tonight. He was driving as the only thin line between a child and a monster. He had ruled the city's shadows by one rule: feel nothing. For over 2 decades, he had carved his name into the streets with calculated brutality and an iron fist. His tattoos, vivid and dark against his muscular frame, were warnings to anyone who dared cross him. But as he gripped the steering wheel, watching the streetlights streak past like golden bullets, the business logic he used to survive was failing him. The GPS announced 12 minutes to the suburban address. 12 minutes for a child who might not have 12 seconds. His phone vibrated again with a message that made his chest seize. "I can't find Mama anymore. There's so much red." Dante floored the accelerator. He had driven these streets 1,000 times to end lives, but never once to save one. He wasn't supposed to care about a wrong number call from a girl named Lila. He was supposed to care about territory and the cold, hard numbers of the underworld. But tonight, the weight of a 25-year-old failure was crushing his lungs. And he knew that if he didn't reach that house in time, the monster he had become would be the only thing left of him. The black sedan didn't just move, it hunted. Dante Vane's hands, mapped with the ink of 1,000 dark decisions, gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel until his knuckles threatened to pierce through his skin. On the passenger seat, the burner phone lay face up, its glow illuminating the sharp, tattooed lines of his jaw. Every few seconds, the speaker crackled with a sound that was far more dangerous to Dante's composure than a police siren: the rhythmic, hitching breaths of a terrified 7-year-old. "Lila, talk to me," Dante commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that usually sent grown men reaching for their holsters. Tonight, he forced it to be an anchor. "Tell me what you see." I see the stars on my ceiling," Lila whispered, her voice sounding dangerously distant, like a radio signal fading into a storm. "But they're blurry. I'm so tired, Mr. Dante. I think I'm going to sleep now." "No sleep," Dante barked, his foot bearing the accelerator into the floorboards. The engine roared in protest as the car topped 90 on a residential stretch. Streetlights streaked past the windows like golden bullets, momentarily lighting up the cold, calculated intensity in his eyes. For 23 years, Dante had been the city's ghost, a man who lived by the philosophy of feeling nothing. He had built an empire on that void, yet as he tore through a red light, the silence on the other end of the line felt like a physical weight crushing his lungs. His pulse hammered against his neck, a frantic rhythm he hadn't felt since he was a powerless boy named Danny. The GPS on his dashboard flickered. 8 minutes to destination. It was an eternity. He knew the biology of trauma too well. He knew that when a child's voice got that soft, their body was beginning to shut down from a fear too heavy for small bones to carry. "Lila, listen to my voice," he said, weaving the sedan through a narrow gap between 2 delivery trucks with surgical precision. "I'm passing the old bridge. Do you know the bridge with the green lights? I'm almost there. Keep your eyes open for me." "There's so much red on the carpet," she murmured, ignoring his question. "Mama isn't moving. She looks like she's sleeping, but her eyes won't open. I tried to wake her up, but he pushed me." Dante's vision narrowed until the world was nothing but the gray asphalt and the target, the business logic that governed his life, The cost-benefit analysis of every act of violence had vanished. There was no profit in this run, only a desperate, visceral need to reach that house before the silence became permanent. He wasn't arriving as the Syndicate's most feared enforcer. He was racing against the memory of a kitchen floor from 25 years ago, praying that this time he wouldn't arrive to find the machines already counting down to zero. He was a predator in the night, but for the first time in his life, he was hunting for someone else's survival. The roaring engine of the sedan began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic, ghostly ticking of a radiator in a cramped tenement flat in the winter of 1999. Before he was the Syndicate Ghost, he was just Danny, a boy with scuffed shoes and a heart that still knew how to hope. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, dragging him back to a kitchen that smelled of boiled cabbage and the metallic tang of old pipes. 10-year-old Danny sat at a yellowed Formica table, watching his younger sister, Cora, draw butterflies on the back of a grocery circular. She was a slip of a girl, all knobby knees and bright, observant eyes that saw far too much for a child of 6. Outside their door, the hallway was a war zone of raised voices and heavy footsteps, the sounds of a world that had no room for the soft or the small. "Danny, why is the neighbor man so loud?" Cora had asked, her crayon pausing over a jagged wing. "Is he hurting the lady again?" Danny hadn't known how to tell her that some monsters didn't live up under beds. They lived across the hall and drank from brown paper bags. Instead, he had reached across the table and covered her small hand with his. "Don't listen to that, Cora. It's just noise. As long as I'm here, the noise can't get to you." He remembered the way she had looked at him then, with a terrifying, absolute trust. It was a weight he had carried proudly, a suit of armor he thought was impenetrable. To Cora, her big brother was a giant, a knight who could stop the shadows from creeping under their door. In that tiny, dim kitchen, Danny had leaned in and made the vow that would eventually become the blueprint for his entire life. He promised her that he would become strong. He promised her that when they grew up, he would build a world where no one could ever make her hide under the bed again. Cora had smiled, a small, fragile thing that lit up the gray room, and tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. "You're the bravest knight in the whole city, Danny." The memory of that smile was a jagged shard in Dante's chest. He hadn't known then that being a knight required more than just a willing heart. It required power that he didn't yet possess. He hadn't realized that the noise he promised to keep away would one day shatter the very walls he tried to build. Now, 25 years later, as he gripped the steering wheel of a car built for war, the ghost of that promise was the only thing steering him through the dark. He had failed the girl in the kitchen, but as Lila's labored breathing echoed through the phone, Dante Vane knew he wouldn't fail again. He wasn't just driving toward an address. He was driving back into the fire to save the only part of himself that was still human. The warmth of that memory vanished, replaced by the bone-chilling cold of a rainy Thursday in November. It was the night the music stopped. The noise Danny had promised to keep away hadn't just seeped through the walls, it had detonated. The neighbor, a man whose name had been forgotten but whose shadow still loomed in Dante's nightmares, had finally reached his breaking point. The thin lath and plaster walls of the tenement were no match for the rage of a man with a weapon and nothing to lose. Danny remembered the sudden, sharp crack that sounded like wood splintering, followed by a silence so heavy it felt like it was drowning them. He had lunged for Cora, trying to pull her beneath the heavy oak table, but the world had already tilted on its axis. He felt the weight of her body slump against his chest, not with the playful lean of a sister seeking a hug, but with the terrifying gravity of a falling star. When he looked down, the butterfly she had been drawing was stained a deep, visceral crimson. The bullet hadn't even been meant for them. It was a stray, a piece of leaden indifference that had traveled through the wall to find the only light in Danny's life. He had held her there on the linoleum floor, his small hands pressed desperately against a wound he couldn't close, screaming for help that never came. The police arrived 40 minutes late. The ambulance arrived even later. By the time the sirens finally wailed, Cora's eyes, the ones that saw him as a knight, had turned to glass. In the hollow aftermath of her funeral, something in Danny didn't just break, it cauterized. He looked at the system that was supposed to protect them, the indifferent officers, the overworked social workers, the laws that only seemed to apply after the blood had dried, and he realized that being a knight was a lie. Knights were for fairy tales. In the real world, you either held the blade or you felt it. He didn't want to live in the system anymore. He wanted to be the system. If the law couldn't stop a bullet from traveling through a wall, he would become the wall. He spent the next 25 years trading his name for a title and his skin for a map of scars and ink. He climbed the ranks of the underworld not for the money or the prestige, but for the absolute terrifying power to ensure that no one in his vicinity ever breathed without his permission. He had become Dante Vane, a man carved from ice and iron, believing that if he felt nothing, he could never fail again. But as he gripped the steering wheel in the present day, the ghost of Cora's final, rattling breath echoed through the phone line, reminding him that the empire he had built was just a tomb for a promise that he was finally, desperately trying to keep. The sedan's tires shrieked against the pavement as Dante swung the heavy vehicle into a narrow suburban driveway. He didn't wait for the engine to stop humming before he was out, his boots hitting the gravel with the weight of an approaching storm. The house was a modest two-story structure that looked painfully ordinary from the outside, but the front door hung slightly ajar, a jagged mouth whispering of the violence within. As Dante stepped over the threshold, the silence hit him first, a thick, suffocating quiet that smelled of cheap bourbon and copper. The living room was a disaster zone. It wasn't just messy, it was desecrated. A coffee table lay on its side, its glass top shattered into 1,000 glinting diamonds that crunched under Dante's tread. Pictures that should have held memories of birthdays and holidays were face down, their frames splintered by what looked like the impact of a human body. Dante's eyes, trained to scan for threats in a heartbeat, locked onto the center of the room. There, crumpled against the base of a floral sofa, was Elena Rossi. She was a ghost of a woman, her blonde hair matted with dark, wet strands that clung to her forehead. Her breathing was shallow, a ragged whistle that told Dante her ribs had likely been the price of her silence. She was unconscious, her face a map of blooming purples and angry reds where a heavy fist had repeatedly found its mark. "Elena," he murmured, his voice sounding foreign in the stillness. He knelt beside her for a fraction of a second, his large tattooed hand hovering over her pulse. It was there, weak but stubborn. His gaze shifted to the shadows. The house felt like it was holding its breath. The kitchen light flickered in the distance, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hallway, and the sound of heavy, uneven footsteps creaked from the floorboards above. Dante stood up slowly, his frame expanding as he shed the last remnants of the Danny, who had been too late to save his sister. The Syndicate Ghost took over. His face became a mask of stone, and the cold, calculated fury that had built his empire began to boil. Somewhere in this wreckage, Lila was hiding, and somewhere in the dark, the man who had turned this home into a tomb was still breathing. Dante reached into his coat, not for a weapon, he was the weapon, but to silence his phone. The time for whispers was over. The nightmare had arrived, but for the first time in 25 years, Dante Vane was the scariest thing in the room. The heavy creak of a floorboard upstairs snapped Dante's focus toward the landing. He didn't move with the frantic energy of a hero. He ascended the stairs with the glacial, terrifying confidence of an inevitable consequence. At the top of the flight, a man emerged from the master bedroom, wiping sweat from a forehead that looked far too small for the ego it housed. This was Vance Thorne. He was a broad-shouldered man, built with the thick, soft muscle of someone who only ever fought those smaller than him. In his hand, he clutched a half-empty bottle, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a pathetic, panicked bravado. Dante stopped 3 paces away, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the hallway carpet. He evaluated Vance with the same clinical coldness he used to assess a structural flaw in a rival's warehouse. He didn't see a formidable opponent. He didn't see a warrior. He saw a coward who mistook physical size for power and silence for permission. To Dante, Vance Thorne wasn't a man to be reasoned with or even hated. He was a biological error that needed to be corrected. "Who the hell are you?" Vance slurred, trying to puff out his chest. He took a step forward, the floor groaning under his weight. "You're in the wrong house, pal. Get out before I do to you what I did to her. Dante didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply tilted his head, the light from the hallway flickering off the intricate black ink that crawled up his neck and disappeared into his hairline. You didn't do anything to her, Dante said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that seemed to vibrate the very air between them. You broke a woman who was already exhausted from trying to love a failure like you. That's not a feat of strength, Vance. That's a confession of weakness. Vance's bravado flickered. He saw the way Dante stood, completely still, yet coiled with a lethal tension that made the air in the narrow hallway feel thin. For the first time that night, the predator felt like prey. He raised the bottle like a club, a desperate, clumsy motion, but Dante moved before the man's muscles could even fully contract. In one fluid, violent motion, Dante closed the distance, his hands snapping out to catch Vance by the throat. He didn't strike, he simply squeezed, lifting the larger man into his toes. Dante leaned in close, his eyes reflecting a darkness that had been brewing for 25 years. He wasn't looking at Vance anymore. He was looking through him, seeing every monster that had ever hidden behind a thin wall. This wasn't a fight, it was an extraction, and Dante Vane was about to remove the rot from the room. The struggle was short, brutal, and entirely one-sided. Dante didn't throw a punch. He simply became an unbreakable force of nature. He maintained his iron grip on Vance's throat, the man's heels dragging across the hallway carpet as Dante backed him toward the stairs. There was a clinical precision to the way he navigated the descent, keeping the thrashing man balanced just on the edge of a fall, ensuring the terror stayed fresh and focused. When they reached the ground floor, Dante didn't stop until they were in the kitchen. He hurled Vance toward the back wall with a strength that came from decades of bottled rage. The man hit the tiled surface with a sickening thud, sliding down to the floor amidst the debris of a half-eaten dinner. Dante kicked the kitchen door shut, the click of the latch sounding like the cocking of a hammer in the heavy silence. Vance scrambled to find his breath, gasping for air that felt too thick to swallow. You don't know who you're messing with," he wheezed, his eyes darting toward a block of steak knives on the counter. Dante saw the look. Before Vance's hand could even twitch, Dante's boot slammed into the counter, sending the knife block skidding across the floor and out of reach. He stepped into the light of the flickering overhead bulb, the shadows dancing across the ink on his throat. "I know exactly who you are, Vance," Dante said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "You're the man who thinks respect is something you beat out of a woman when the world makes you feel small. You're the man who thinks power is measured by the tears of a child hiding in a closet." Dante leaned down, his face inches from the coward's. The smell of cheap whiskey and fear wafted off the man, but Dante didn't flinch. "In my world, respect isn't a weapon. It's a currency, and tonight, you've gone bankrupt." He reached out, his large hand wrapping around the back of Vance's neck, forcing the man to look at the wreckage in the living room through the door's small window. "Look at what you did. You didn't just break a table or a woman's ribs. You broke a sanctuary. You taught a little girl that home isn't safe. And that," Dante's voice cracked like a whip, "is a sin even a man like me can't ignore." Vance's bravado had completely dissolved, replaced by a raw, shaking desperation. He realized then that he wasn't facing a man who was angry. He was facing a man who had become a mirror of his own violence, refined and perfected into something lethal. Dante wasn't there to argue or even to punish him in the traditional sense. He was there to erase the illusion of Vance's control. "You think you're a king in this little house?" Dante murmured, his grip tightening until Vance's eyes began to bulge. "But you're about to find out how quickly a kingdom can turn into a cage when the real wolf comes to visit." The burner phone in Dante's pocket vibrated with the persistence of a trapped insect. His lieutenants were calling, likely frantic over why their lead enforcer had abandoned a high-stakes meeting to vanish into a suburban cul-de-sac. In the cold, unyielding world of the Syndicate, disappearing without an explanation was a sign of weakness or betrayal. Dante pulled the device from his coat, the screen lighting up with a dozen missed alerts, and without looking at them, He let the phone drop into a sink full of murky water. He watched it sink, the light flickering out beneath the surface, severing his connection to the empire he had spent 2 decades building. He turned his full attention back to the man shivering on the floor. Vance Thorne looked smaller now, the predatory ego that had fueled his violence stripped away to reveal a hollow, pathetic core. Dante reached down and grabbed Vance by the collar, hauling him up until their faces were inches apart. The Syndicate Ghost didn't need a gun. His eyes held enough death to still a man's heart. "You have 24 hours, Dante said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that felt like sandpaper against the silence of the kitchen. Not 25, not a day and a minute. 24 hours to erase yourself from this city. If the sun sets tomorrow and your shadow is still touching Chicago dirt, I will find you. And when I find you, I won't be coming as a man. I'll be coming as the consequence you've been running from your entire life." Vance tried to speak, his teeth chattering against each other, but no words came out. He looked at the tattoos on Dante's neck, the ink-black reminders of a life forged in blood, and he knew this wasn't a negotiation. It was a stay of execution with a very short fuse. "You won't take anything from this house," Dante continued, his grip tightening. "No clothes, no money, and certainly no memories of the people inside. You will walk out that door as a ghost, and if you ever try to haunt them again, I will make sure you spend the rest of eternity wishing you had died tonight." Dante shoved him toward the back door. Vance stumbled, nearly falling over his own feet, before scrambling out into the night. He didn't look back. He ran into the shadows, a terrified animal fleeing a predator it couldn't comprehend. Dante stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the darkness swallow the man whole. He had the power to end Vance right there, to leave a permanent mark on the kitchen floor, but he chose a different kind of justice. He chose to let the mother and daughter breathe again without the stench of a corpse in their home. As he closed the door and turned back toward the living room, the weight of the syndicate felt lighter, and the ghost of his sister Cora felt, for the first time in 25 years, like she was finally resting. The house had fallen into a heavy, ringing silence after the back door clicked shut. Dante stood in the center of the kitchen, his lungs expanding with the first clean breath he had taken in years. The air no longer tasted of Vance's cowardice. It tasted of a beginning. He moved toward the small hallway that led to the bedrooms, his heavy boots treading lightly, almost reverently, over the debris-strewn carpet. He reached the closet under the stairs, a cramped, dark space where the vacuum and old coats lived, and knelt. His knees popped in the quiet, a reminder of the miles and the years he had traveled to get to this door. "Lila," he said softly. He kept his voice low, stripping away the gravel of the syndicate enforcer and reaching for the gentleness of the boy who used to read to Cora by candlelight. "It's Dante. He's gone. You can come out now." The door creaked open an inch, then two. A pair of wide, dark eyes peered out from the shadows, reflecting the dim hallway light. Lila was smaller than she had sounded on the phone, a fragile bird of a girl, clutching a tattered teddy bear as if it were a shield. She looked at Dante, at the intimidating tattoos crawling up his neck, at the scars on his knuckles, and the sheer, looming size of him. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then she didn't shrink back. She stepped out and walked straight into the space he had cleared for her. She didn't see the monster the rest of the city feared. She saw the man who had promised to come and who had kept that promise. Lila wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face in the expensive wool of his coat. "You came," she whispered, her voice hitching. "I knew you were a knight. I told Mama a knight was coming." The words hit Dante like a physical impact, shattering the last of the ice he had built around his heart since 1999. In that tiny hallway, the decades of blood and betrayal seemed to wash away, replaced by the warmth of a child's absolute trust. He closed his eyes, resting his chin on her small shoulder. And for the first time in 25 years, the face of his sister Cora didn't bring a wave of crushing guilt. It brought a sense of peace. He had been too late for one girl in a tenement kitchen, but he was exactly on time for this one. As he held her, Dante realized the walls he had built to protect himself hadn't just kept the world out. They had kept his soul in a cage. Lila's small, shaking hand reached up and touched a tattoo on his cheek, a silent gesture of gratitude that healed a wound deeper than any bullet could ever reach. He wasn't just a fixer or an enforcer anymore. In the eyes of a child who had been saved from the dark, Dante Vane had finally become the man his sister always believed he could be. He pulled back slightly, looking at her with a clarity he hadn't possessed since childhood. "I'm not leaving, Lila," he promised, and this time the vow felt like it was written in stone. "No one is ever going to hurt you or your mama again." 6 months had passed since the night the world tilted on its axis, and the industrial skyline of the city looked different to Dante Vane. He sat in his parked sedan at the end of a sun-drenched suburban street, the engine idling with a quiet, contented hum. He wasn't there to collect a debt or deliver an ultimatum. He was there to watch a little girl in a yellow dress chase a golden retriever across a manicured lawn. Lila's laughter carried on the breeze, a bright melodic sound that seemed to scrub the remaining soot from Dante's soul. On the porch, Elena Rossi sat in a wicker chair, the afternoon sun catching the highlights of her hair. The bruises were gone, replaced by a glow of health and a peace that had once seemed impossible. She knew her rent was paid through an anonymous trust, and she knew that the neighborhood watch wasn't just made up of concerned citizens, but of silent, stone-faced men who answered to a higher power. She never asked where the help came from, but sometimes she would look toward the end of the street and offer a small, knowing nod to the dark car idling in the shadows. Dante looked down at his hands. The tattoos were still there, the ink a permanent record of his history, but they no longer felt like shackles. He had spent 23 years building an empire of fear, believing that power was the only way to prevent another Cora. He had been wrong. Real power wasn't found in the bullets he dealt or the territories he expanded. It was found in the safety of a child who no longer had to hide in a closet. He had restructured his organization with the same clinical efficiency he once used for violence. The Syndicate was transitioning into a guardian network. Word had traveled through the gutter and the high-rises alike. The Vane territory was now a sanctuary for the vulnerable, and the price for violating that sanctuary was a visit from a ghost. His phone buzzed. Not a burner, but a private line. A picture message appeared on the screen. It was Lila, holding up a drawing of a knight in black armor with a small butterfly resting on his shoulder. Dante felt a genuine smile tug at the corner of his mouth, a sensation so rare it felt like a miracle. He had lost his sister to the noise of a broken world, but he had found his redemption in the silence of a wrong number call. As he shifted the car into gear and pulled away, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady light. He was still a man of the shadows, and he would always carry the weight of his sins, but he was no longer a monster. He was a protector. The empire of fear had fallen, and in its place a new kingdom had risen, one built on a kept promise and the innocent trust of a little girl who had dialed the right number at exactly the right time.